Hello and welcome to this revision webcast, which this time is focusing on AS macro, and in particular we're going to have a look at the multiplier process, the multiplier effect, and also something called the accelerator effect. So this is a 15-20 minute diet of macroeconomics, and hopefully you'll get some good relevant examples to think about as part of your revision. So we're going to focus first of all on something called the multiplier. And the multiplier is best described either as an effect or as a process. But at heart, actually, the multiplier is just a number. What it means is that if there's a change in one or more of the components of aggregate demand, eventually, when the circular flow effects have worked their way through, you get a multiplied final change in the equilibrium level of GDP, or national output. So why do we get this multiplier effect? What's causing it? It's quite important when you're explaining the multiplier to understand that it comes from the idea that one person's spending, be it a consumer or a business, in the wider circular flow, one person's spending is somebody else's income. So we get a series of rounds of spending on goods and services which feed their way through to output and to jobs. Ultimately, we get what's called a multiplier effect. In the event, the final effect on national output, national income and employment is likely to be bigger than the initial change or the initial injection in aggregate demand. Now that's what we mean by the multiplier. Now, different people are taught the multiplier in different ways. Some people are given a simple value for the multiplier, which is 1 over the marginal propensity to consume. The marginal propensity to consume, by the way, is the proportion of the last pound somebody earns that's used for spending on domestically produced goods and services. My formula at the bottom of this slide is the slightly wider, larger formula, slightly more complex. The multiplier is 1 divided by the sum of the marginal propensity to save, to tax, and import. So MPC, the proportion of the last pound earned that is spent on consumption. Marginal propensity to save, the proportion of the last pound earned that is saved instead of spent. Marginal propensity to tax is, if you like, the marginal tax rate of the government on income that's being earned. And the crucial point, the marginal propensity to import, is the proportion of the last pound of income that goes on imported goods and services, rather than stays within the circular flow. We add those three together, savings, tax, and imports, you get what's sometimes called the marginal propensity to withdraw. And essentially the multiplier is 1 divided by that marginal propensity to withdraw. Now the best way to really explain the multiplier, I think, is to give an example. And the example we're going to look at is house building. House building is in the news. It's extremely topical. Part of the election campaign, part of the debate is, why is it that isn't building enough new homes, either to buy or to rent? We'll take an example of the government injecting some money into perhaps a social housing project with the aim of increasing the housing stock by several thousand. So the initial government spending, the value of the project is £200 million. The multiplier would suggest that the final effect on GDP is going to be significantly more than £200 million. And that's certainly what the government would hope is going to put that kind of money into this project. Here's an example of house building in the news, just taken from a few weeks back. That the level of house building in Scotland has risen by 6%. Okay, 15,000 plus homes completed, quite significant from the previous year. That represents, if you like, an injection into the circular flow, and one would hope that building new homes would have a positive multiplier effect, either at a local level or a regional level in a town or a city, or hopefully even at a national level. A multiplier can be brought into many discussions. So the government's going to inject this money into this project. Initially, we think the multiplier, the value of the spending is £200 million. If at the end, the final rise in GDP is, let's say, £300 million, then we just divide the 300 by the initial injection and we get a coefficient for the multiplier of plus 1.5. However, if the final increase is not quite as big, let's say £250 million, if we add them all together, then the multiplier effect is smaller. Still greater than 1, but not quite as significant. What you'll find is that there is a huge debate in modern macroeconomics about the likely size of the multiplier effect, the likely scale of the coefficient of the multiplier. Keynesian economists tend to believe that the fiscal multiplier effects are really quite high. If governments target their spending or target their tax cuts or invest in infrastructure, they argue that there's a strong multiplier effect. And clearly they then, following on from that, they argue for high levels of government spending, indeed some spending financed by borrowing. The alternative view is that the multiplier effect is really quite small, that if governments spend more, then actually that could crowd out the private sector and you end up with a final multiplier which is significantly smaller than the Keynesians would argue. So keep in mind that the multiplier is very topical in the sort of current debate about fiscal policy in particular and the effects of fiscal austerity. Let's go back to our example. Now, I strongly advise in the exam that you give some feel for, you give it an understanding of the process involved in the multiplier. So what's happening here? The government's injecting spending into new affordable homes. That is a direct injection of demand into the circular flow. But then we get the multiplier process hopefully starting to kick in, because there will be a supply chain effect as businesses directly or indirectly linked to the housing sector will also start to feel the benefit. It could be suppliers of plumbing, electrics, cement, bricks, the building supply industry. It could be surveyors, designers, architects, landscape gardeners, etc. There could well be a significant number of businesses connected to this project that would actually benefit from the increased spending. And then the process of building new homes. Of course, there's always a time lag. The process of building new homes should, in theory, generate an extra flow of factor incomes. Always worth putting that word factor into your answer. Factor incomes, wages, people employed in construction, profits to construction companies and to the suppliers. We're going to create some more factor incomes, which goes around the circular flow once more. The key question when it comes to the multiplier is whether the extra income actually stays within the circular flow and goes around again, or does it leak out in savings, in tax, or in buying imported goods and services. So if the circular flow is resilient, if the money stays inside the circular flow, then we're likely to see quite a strong multiplier effect. The final effect on GDP could be quite significant. If the withdrawal rate, savings, tax, imports, if that's quite high, that's going to result in a lower multiplier figure. Sometimes in the exam, students will be asked a numerical example, how a change in, for example, the propensity to save or import or tax could actually influence the value of the multiplier. Here's a numerical example. There's quite a lot to get your head around here, but I'm going to assume if you go to the top left of the slide that for each extra £100 of income we create, 10% is saved, 20% is taken in tax, direct tax, and 20% is spent on imported goods and services. So for every £100 of extra income, effectively 50% leaks from the circular flow every time it goes around. So every time the money goes around the circular flow, the total will get smaller. And you can see that at the bottom of the slide. So a £200 million injection will have a £100 million of withdrawal. That creates an extra £100 million of GDP, which the next time around is 50. Now 200 plus 100 plus 50, well, that's already 350. It's getting smaller each time. The next one will be 25, etc. You can do the maths. The multiplier is 1 divided by the marginal propensity to withdraw. 1, in this case, it's 1 divided by 0.5, which equals 2. If the propensities to withdraw were smaller, the value of the multiplier would be higher. So you can either use the multiplier in using a numerical example, or if you want to use some analysis diagrams, you can show the multiplier effect at work using aggregate demand and supply. In the diagram here on the left-hand side, I've drawn the aggregate supply curve, short-run sort of supply curve for the economy, as perfectly elastic. And that means that any increase in demand feeds through straight away to a higher level of national output without an increase in inflation. In that situation, the multiplier effect is likely to be quite high. I make a contrast here with this diagram on the right-hand side, where a similar shift in aggregate demand is met with an inelastic supply curve. The economy is going to find it hard to generate the extra output and incomes. And so instead, we get a small change in national income, but we also see an increase in inflation, which would obviously dampen real incomes and real profits, and therefore make the multiplier effect much smaller. So elasticity of aggregate supply is going to be a factor affecting the value of the multiplier effect in a macro economy. So let's just summarize what really determines the value of the multiplier effect. The multiplier's value tends to be high when an economy has a lot of spare capacity. Now that is typically when it's coming out of recession, when there's a large negative output gap, and when there are plenty of spare factor resources that can be brought into play. I feel like it's quite a convincing argument for building roads, building homes, infrastructure projects, environmental projects, to lift an economy out of recession. Keynesians would argue that the multiplier effect, the fiscal multiplier in this case, is stronger when an economy has plenty of spare capacity. If you were to depreciate the exchange rate and hopefully boost exports, the export multiplier effect is stronger when the economy has plenty of spare capacity. Multiplier effect is also higher when there's a low propensity to import, or when the marginal rate of tax is low. So, for example, a new government reducing the marginal rate of tax on low incomes means that any extra income earned by somebody, for example, working in retail or construction, is more likely to be kept as disposable income and therefore more likely to be spent within the circular flow. And the multiplier effect is also high when the propensity to consume is high. In other words, when the propensity to save is low. People receive extra income and they spend it instead of saving it. Conversely, the multiplier effect tends to be lower when the economy is booming and it's reaching its capacity constraints. It's coming close to its full capacity levels, and aggregate supply is inelastic. And any rise in demand tends to be inflationary, and higher inflation eats into real incomes, and also it obviously oftentimes leads to higher policy interest rates from the central bank. So that explains why the multiplier could be quite low. One of the related topics here, it's to do with the multiplier, is the idea of the fiscal multiplier. We're just going to have a quick look at this. This is the idea when governments spend new money on hospitals and schools and roads, what have you, how big is the likely effect on aggregate demand, and how strong is the final effect on real output, incomes, jobs in the economy. Now the IMF, who for many, many years were fiscal conservatives, they're changing their tune a little bit now. They think the multiplier effect for fiscal stimulus policies is actually a little higher than they once anticipated, they once estimated. They think it's about plus 1.5 for advanced countries, OECD countries including the UK and the United States. It's possibly a little higher for developing countries, perhaps with lower tax rates and lower propensity to import. Either way, the IMF is saying that the multiplier is positive, and that's really quite an important idea to take into a fiscal austerity debate. Just before we move on to the accelerator, very quickly, I just wanted to give you some examples of infrastructure projects. My gut instinct is that these are big topics that examiners like to test, like to bring into the discussion. There's a lot of macroeconomics that you can get stuck into with these ones. So here are some examples of sort of current infrastructure projects, which I think have multiplier effects. The second Forth Road Bridge in Scotland, currently the construction, the big investment by the Beijing Construction Group in trying to develop a new logistics and entertainment and leisure hub for Manchester in and around the airport there. These are significant projects which I think have a quite strong regional multiplier effect. And then dotted around the country, the government's already announced, if you pardon the pun, a flood of new flood defence projects. Now those will have local multiplier effects, just particularly if they're worth £7 million. Crossrail, £15 billion, incredible project to give London a new west-east, east-west fast train service. A game changer in my opinion, a phenomenal project, on time, under budget, significant multiplier effects for the London economy and also for the regional economy. If high-speed rail comes up, enormous dispute and debate about whether or not there's a strong multiplier effect there. And we get into other areas, the London Gateway Port, the super sewer being built by Thames Water, and of course, whether we should be going ahead and spending billions of pounds on nuclear power plants. The point I'm making here is that infrastructure projects, infrastructure is so topical at the moment. And if one or more of these projects or the general idea of infrastructure comes up, please make sure you talk about the multiplier effects and discuss the likely size of those as part of your analysis and evaluation. Just moving on finally to look at the accelerator. Not every board covers the accelerator. I teach it because I think it's kind of important here. The accelerator is the effect on investment of a change in consumer demand for goods and services. And the basic idea here is actually quite simple but quite powerful, that when there is a strong growth of demand in a market or a sector or an industry, oftentimes you will see businesses looking to invest more, to ramp up capacity, to give themselves the wherewithal to meet actual and expected demand. So typically in the short term, when demand rises, firms tend to run down their stocks, make better, more intensive use of productive capacity. But ultimately in the long run, if demand is going to stay high and is expected to rise, then businesses will need to invest. And this is basically what we call the accelerator effect. Let's give you a few examples. Many of you will be using cloud storage services such as Dropbox. And there's been a huge growth of consumer demand in that sector. And clearly, these businesses have to invest to create the extra capacity. That's the accelerator effect at work. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Dubai teaching some economics and flying on Emirates. Emirates has developed Dubai Airport into one of the world's, if not the world's, biggest hub airport. Their fleet grows pretty much by the month. They are hoping that Dubai will become one of the leading hub airports globally for many years to come. And clearly the growth of that industry has an accelerator effect in terms of demand for aircraft, for ancillary equipment, and ultimately for the size of terminals and expansions of runways, etc. Another example is mobile networks. Huge questions here. Who's going to pay? Who is going to pay for 4G, the 5G mobile networks as we move to a world of smart watches, ubiquitous smartphones, and the Internet of Things? Who's going to create that capacity? Well, if the demand for data, the demand for network space grows, that is going to create an accelerator effect. There's going to be a need to install more capacity, more bandwidth, what have you. The debate about who pays is fundamentally, I feel like, a microeconomic question. And more generally, again, topical issues, the idea of the shift towards renewable energy. Some countries achieving this at a pace. Germany is a really good example. China making enormous strides in developing renewable energy capacity. Again, the demand for renewable energy, policy incentives, creating an investment effect. Lots of risks and bumps and borrows along the way, but this is a positive accelerator effect at work. Takeaway point from this slide is that when demand growth is strong in a market, in an industry, we tend to see a significant growth of investment. That is what's called the accelerator. The multiplier is when a change in investment leads to a change in national income. The accelerator is when a change in national income leads to a change in investment. However, it can work both ways. The multiplier effect can be positive, it can be negative too. The accelerator effect can also be negative. And equally, I've given you 4 examples of growing sectors where demand is rising. There can also be industries in decline, where the rate of growth of demand slows down or actually falls, and you're left with excess capacity, perhaps where government cuts back on subsidies, and the net effect is that you just don't need to invest as much in new capacity or even in replacement investment. So when you get an economic slowdown, such as, for example, is happening in China at the moment, it's definitely happening in countries like Brazil, when you get a slowdown in growth, oftentimes you could see an actual fall in business capital investment. And that will be called a negative accelerator effect. So this was a short revision webcast on the multiplier effect and the accelerator, please do get in touch with the team on Twitter and through the website for more revision resources. We look forward to joining you at another time to help you with your revision. Thank you.